Huey Edwards isn't on the news, but he's in the news. He's not on the news because he's in a hospital. In a hospital, presumably specializing in mental health issues, because his own wife issued a statement late this afternoon naming her husband as the mysterious hitherto BBC personality central to BBC output, who is alleged to have paid £35,000 to a 17-year-old crack addict in exchange for lewd pictures. It appears that the whole thing was a midlife crisis, although his wife said he's been mentally ill for years, which, as I said, is passing strange, as the BBC have been using him for all of those years as their principal mouthpiece for British state propaganda. Now, I feel sympathy for anybody with mental health issues. It can happen to anyone. It happened to Philip Schofield, the ITV personality. He had mental health issues also, but only once he'd been found out for the rakish, reprobate life that he had been leading. Let me put one thing very firmly on the table. It's okay to be gay. Many of my friends are gay. I have been a champion of gay and lesbian rights all of my political life, long before it became vogue, long before it became a twibbon, long before the arms manufacturers started to put rainbows on their missiles and bombs. But it's not okay to be married and have children and lie to your wife and those children about a second life, a double life, on gay dating apps, because you're not brave when you are finally unmasked or come out just before you're unmasked. You're a coward, a liar, a cheat, and a deceiver. And that's what Philip Schofield was, and it may turn out that's what Hugh Edwards was also. It's possible that the balance of his mind was affected, but it's unlikely to have been affected to the extent that he merely imagined he should be putting his details on a gay dating site, meeting teenage schoolboys, even if they are over the age of consent, for illicit purposes, and then going home to Mrs. Edwards and pretending that nothing happened. But beyond that, I care about for every other person in Great Britain for a TV license for a state broadcaster that turns out to be a nest, not just of liberal fanatics in the grip of every Islamist known to man, woman, stroke, other, but is a veritable nest of perverts, of people involved in the most murky and sordid, funded by me and by you. Sir, that's what he was called, Jimmy Savile, was paid millions of pounds by you, and Hugh Edwards was earning £640,000 every single year for reading an auto cue of British state propaganda. That money was yours. That money was mine. 35,000 of it, mind you, was recycled, trickled down, you might call it, though that metaphor may be verging on the obscene. These people in the BBC don't just think they're better than us. Don't just think that we are less than them. Every day, it seems, even on company property, certainly on company money, your money, my money, they are engaged in the kind of behaviors which have dragged our country into the mire, a mire in which the BBC then gleefully wallows, indeed frolics, dances, TikToks around. Well, the BBC doesn't speak for me, even though I'll go to prison if I stop paying them to pretend to do so. It is now an unstoppable demand that the British people must no longer be forced to pay for this sordid apology for a television broadcaster that the BBC has become. Defund the BBC, abolish the licence fee, and enough now about Hugh Edwards, his mental health, and his dirty habits. Let me turn to much more important issues. Vladimir or Vladimir or Mr. Zelensky, sometimes President Zelensky, it depends which part of Joe Biden's 60 seconds you're referring to. In fact, if the brain boxes behind the glass here have got that, let's take a quick look at some of Joe Biden's latest finest.
Vladimir and I shouldn't be so familiar. Mr. Zelensky and I, Vladimir and I shouldn't be so familiar. Mr. Zelensky and I
shouldn't be so familiar. Vladimir, Mr. Zelensky should have consulted the history books to read what happens to American puppets when America has no further use for them. They could have consulted the record of what happened to the once mighty Shah, forced to wander the earth like a ghost ship when the United States abandoned him in 1979 upon the success of the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Or, gone back further, could have looked at the Diem brothers in South Vietnam. They ended up actually dead, full of lead. He could have looked at the latest example, the what's-his-name, last president of American and UK-controlled Afghanistan. What was his name again? Sure, he made it out with a lot of money bags, but nobody remembers his name, nobody mentions him, nobody laments him. He is a non-person for the people whose puppet he was. Zelensky will go the same way if he gets out alive. If he gets out alive to one of his waterfront properties in multiple countries across the globe, he might regard it as something of a personal success. Unfortunately, hundreds of thousands of his compatriots had to leave their guts on the ground, on the steppe, on the Ukrainian battlefield in order for Vladimir, Mr. Zelensky to momentarily be important in the world, but he sure wasn't important in Vilnius. The pictures tell the story. They tell far more than 1,000 words. Zelensky had gone there, demanding either membership of NATO right now or a clear path and a timetable for Ukrainian entry into NATO, neither of which was forthcoming. Moreover, the worm has begun to turn. Little Ben Wallace, too cowardly to roar like the cowardly lion in The Wizard of Oz, too cowardly to roar at anybody except someone who he knows will not, for the moment at least, strike him back, unleashed a torrent of abuse against Vladimir, Mr. Zelensky. He said that Britain and the West were not Amazon, and that gratitude from Ukraine was necessary to be shown in order to keep the Western public on side. We are not Amazon, he said. No, you're right. Nothing that you supply, Mr. Wallace, is remotely as good as anything you'll get pretty damn quickly from Amazon. Amazon's things work. If they don't, you get your money back or the product replaced. Your things don't work and are very quickly indeed destroyed. We are not Amazon. You should say thank you, said little Ben Wallace. And all of the Western media is this evening echoing that same thing, that the Ukrainians should cool down, that Zelensky should cool down his criticism of what they call the alliance, an alliance which actually suffered a double blow today. Not only did they betray Vladimir, Mr. Zelensky, they pulled out of their real estate deal in Tokyo, Japan. You'll remember, I told you, they were going to open a NATO East, a NATO Tokyo, NATO Japan. France objected. The idea has been dropped unceremoniously in the summit of NATO today. But as I said, Wallace is demanding some gratitude from the Ukrainians. But in fact, it should be the other way around. The Ukrainians were asked, told, pushed, cajoled, encouraged, armed, propagandized for by NATO, not the other way around. This war was created by NATO. The Ukrainians are merely the poor bloody infantry sent to die or be maimed or be paralyzed forever or be mentally damaged forever on behalf of NATO, not the other way around. There's no gratitude required from Ukraine to you, Mr. Wallace. It is you who pushed these people into this now simply impossible position. As I said earlier, the Russians are now, as of this evening, on a major offensive. They have broken through the Ukrainian lines, those lines that were supposed to be the springboard for the spring, then summer, counter-offensive. Well, the counter-offensive is right now being countered. The lines are being overrun, and the pincer is moving fast towards that famed, fabled city of Kupiansk, about which I often speak, which is under heavy artillery bombardment right now as I speak this minute. This war is going to be over much quicker than you thought, because this is a pivotal moment, a hinge moment, a moment at which NATO blinked. They will not enter the war. They won't even discuss any Ukrainian entity joining NATO until the war is over. And that makes clear what the basis of this war being over will look like. I tweeted it out earlier today in more detail. But in truth, Ukraine is no more as a state that we knew and recognized, albeit for a very brief historical period of time. There will now be two Ukraines. There will be a Russian Ukraine, which will take the entire seaboard, including the great Russian city of Odessa, leaving so everything east of the Dnipro and south to the seaboard will be Russian Ukraine. Then there will be what we might call, for the purposes of argument, a Western Ukraine. Although that Western Ukraine will be subject to both Polish and Hungarian revanchist ambitions, who consider part of that West Ukrainian territory to be their own, and they will seek to recover them. I myself will oppose any such effort. But the regime in Kiev will have to change. No end to this war is possible with Zelensky still in power, with Budyanov still in charge of the intelligence, with the missing head of the armed forces of Ukraine, Zaluzhny, still in charge. These things will not be able to bring the war to an end. So a regime change in Western Ukraine will have to happen. And that new regime will have to cast iron guarantee that the Western Ukrainian entity will never joined the European Union will never join NATO, and more importantly, that neither the European Union nor NATO will ever be in Western Ukraine. Not a single footprint of either of these entities will ever be in Western Ukraine. In short, Western Ukraine will become the new East Germany, a buffer between Russia and the hostile powers of Germany, Poland, and the rest of NATO to a variety of degrees. That end is coming sooner than you think. It is the only possible end now. And now that we know that NATO will not be entering the war and Ukraine will not be entering NATO, that's the reason for the counteroffensive tonight, and that's the reason for its apparent success in just the last few hours. We'll be talking to two of the great heroes of contemporary journalism. They probably don't see themselves that way, but they have prank called the very worst people in the entire world and shown them to be the fools that they are. Stay tuned for Vovan and Lexus. You ain't seen nothing like it yet.